She had been in their house 11 days before she made the mistake of telling the truth. One maid, 3 brothers, one question she should never have answered. Nobody lasted long in their household. This was known. Halima Adebayo was going to last. She had decided this on the bus ride to the estate, her reference folder on her lap, her jaw set. She needed this job. Her younger brother's tuition wasn't going to pay itself, and the Kwan household paid 3 times the market rate for live-in staff, which everyone in the agency had told her was because 3 times the market rate was the only way to get anyone to stay. She had taken the job because she needed it, not because she was brave, not because she was foolish, though standing in that corridor on Thursday morning with all 3 of them closing in around her, she was beginning to question both. They hadn't touched her. They didn't need to. Seungjun in front, Jin Woo to her left, Min Jae behind her right shoulder with his voice arriving somewhere below her ear like something private. And the corridor that had seemed perfectly adequate 60 seconds ago had become the smallest space she had ever occupied.
What exactly did you say about us, Halima?
She lifted her chin. She told the truth. She watched Min Jae laugh and swallow it. She watched Jin Woo go quiet in a new way. She watched Seungjun look at her like a man who had just decided something. That was the beginning. By the end of the month, they had cornered her again. Not in a corridor this time, but in their bedroom, all 3 of them. The low light and the silence and that specific, patient, enormous want in their eyes. And the sound she made was nothing like fear. It was something she had never made before, something she would never take back. Welcome to Afro-Korean Drama Empire Chocolate Drops. Please like, share, and subscribe. Let's dive in. The uniform was the first thing. Deep burgundy with black trim along the collar and cuffs, buttons polished to a mirror finish, the apron edges crisp and deliberate. It fit her the way the designer had clearly not intended, built for someone narrower, someone less curved. And Halima spent the first morning tugging the hem straight and reminding herself that dignity was a decision, not a circumstance. Mrs. O was the head housekeeper. She was 64 years old, 4'11", and had the energy of someone who ran on cold judgment and black tea. She had worked in the Kwan household for 22 years. She showed Halima the kitchen, the schedules, the rules, and there were many rules delivered without inflection, the way someone reads a legal document aloud. And then she looked at Halima over the top of her glasses with an expression that contained a warning Halima couldn't yet translate. The young masters, Mrs. O said, are not to be engaged in personal conversation. Understood. They are not to be looked at directly unless addressed. Understood. And, Mrs. O said, folding her hands, whatever you hear in this house stays in this house. Halima looked at her. Understood. Mrs. O studied her for another 3 seconds. Then she nodded once, the way a general nods before sending someone into difficult terrain, and walked away. She met all 3 of them on the second day. Not formally, not with an introduction. She was carrying a breakfast tray down the east corridor when all 3 appeared at the far end of it simultaneously, which she would learn was their habit, moving together like a front. And she stopped because there was nowhere to go, and the tray was heavy, and she had about 1 second to decide whether to pretend she hadn't seen them. She didn't pretend. She stood her ground, shifted the tray to one hip, and gave them the polite, neutral look she used on difficult situations. Present, composed, not inviting conversation. They stopped walking. All 3 of them, at the same time. Seungjun looked at her the way you look at something that wasn't there yesterday. Jin Woo said nothing, which she was learning was his natural state. Min Jae tilted his head and smiled with his mouth only. New? Min Jae said. Yes, sir. How long have you been here? 2 days. He nodded slowly, that smile still sitting on his face like it was waiting for something. And how are you finding it? The house is well organized, Halima said. Mrs. O runs a tight schedule. Min Jae glanced at his brothers. Something passed between the 3 of them, some silent, fluent, triplet-specific language she had no access to. And then Seungjun looked at her one more time just briefly before walking past. Jin Woo followed. Min Jae lingered for exactly 2 more seconds, that smile widening slightly, and then he followed too. Halima let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding and kept walking. By the end of the first week, she had developed a working theory. The Quan triplets were the most powerful men in 3 provinces. Their organization controlled shipping routes, construction contracts, and the kind of financial infrastructure that moved so quietly through legitimate business that most people never thought to look underneath it. They were untouchable in the way that old money combined with new ruthlessness produced. Not loudly, not showily, but absolutely, completely, in a way that had no edges. And they lived, the 3 of them, in a house with no women, no girlfriends, no dates, no late-night visitors that Halima had seen, and Mrs. O's schedule meant she saw most things. The male staff kept a careful, professional distance. The brothers moved through the house like a closed system, speaking to each other in low voices, occasionally laughing. And when they laughed, it was startling. Because it was so different from everything else about them, warm and sudden and briefly, entirely human. She hadn't meant to form the theory. It had formed itself, quietly, from available evidence. The problem was that she mentioned it to the other new maid, a girl named Suji, one evening in the kitchen. Quietly. In what she believed was confidence, Suji had a bigger mouth than Halima had accounted for. The confrontation happened on a Thursday morning. Halima was polishing the long mirror in the 3rd-floor corridor, a task Mrs. O had assigned with the precision of a military order, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, all 3 of them, again with the appearing in formation. She was starting to think they rehearsed it. "Halima," Sungjun said. Her name in his voice was a different thing than it was in anyone else's. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had already decided what came next. She set down the cloth. "Good morning, sir. We'd like to ask you something." This was not a request. She understood that, but she kept her expression neutral. Of course. The 3 of them arranged themselves with the kind of casual precision that was, she was realizing, their signature, not threatening exactly, but forming a shape around her in the corridor that left no easy exit. Jinwoo leaned against the wall to her left. Minjae stood slightly behind and to her right. Sungjun was directly in front of her, 3 feet away, hands in the pockets of his jacket, watching her with those winter stone eyes. "We heard," Minjae said from behind her right shoulder, his voice pleasant, "that you've been sharing observations with the other staff." Halima kept her spine straight. "I may have said something I shouldn't have." "What did you say?" Jinwoo's voice, from the left. Quiet. Even. She looked at Sungjun because he was the one in front of her, and she wasn't going to spin in circles like they were orchestrating. "I said something I shouldn't have," she repeated. "I'll apologize to anyone who needs an apology." Minjae made a soft sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's not the question, Halima." "What's the question, then?" Sungjun tilted his head very slightly. "The question is what, exactly, you said." She held his gaze. She knew her face was giving nothing away because she had practiced giving nothing away under pressure since she was 16 years old and had learned the hard way that showing fear was an invitation. But underneath the composure, her heart was doing something loud and ungraceful, and she needed it to stop. "People," she said, keeping her voice level, "have been... They said... There was a discussion about why..." She stopped, took one breath. "People said you might be..." Another stop. The word arrived, and her voice performed a small, involuntary betrayal. "Gay," she finished. The corridor went very quiet. All 3 of them looked at her. Sungjun's expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted, something that might, in a different light, look like the beginning of amusement or the beginning of something else entirely. And she genuinely could not tell which. Minjae made a sound that was absolutely a laugh this time, brief and sharp, quickly controlled. Jinwoo said nothing. He was looking at her with an attention that made her feel strangely like a document being read for the second time. "And," Sungjun said, "what do you think?" "I think," Halima said, because she was not built for strategic retreat and she had already said the word, "that it's not my business either way and I should have kept my mouth shut." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have, sir." The 3 of them looked at each other over her head in that silent language she couldn't translate. Then Minjae, still from behind her right shoulder, whispered in her ears with a voice that was low and warm and entirely teasing, Would you like to taste the monsters for yourself and confirm if it would rise for you?" He grinned devilishly, and she gulped and gasped for breath. She hadn't survived that when Jinwoo pinned her against the wall with his hands above her head and said in a raspy tone, "You'll find out eventually that we're not, Halima, and your legs might go wobbly before the main action might have started." She turned to look at him, because that sentence required looking at whoever said it. He smiled at her, full this time, and it was a completely different thing than the professional pleasantness he used on everyone else. It was direct and deliberate, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest with an impact she had absolutely no framework for. She turned back to Sungjun. He was watching her face with the focused stillness of a man cataloging something. "Back to work," he said quietly. She picked up her cloth. Her hands were steady. She was very proud of her hands, but not of how she was feeling hot between her legs. When they had gone, the sound of 3 sets of footsteps retreating down the corridor in their characteristic synchronized rhythm, she let herself lean, just slightly, against the mirror she'd been polishing, and stared at her own reflection for a moment. Sharp-tongued, her mother had always said, like it was a warning, like it was something to be managed. She had been sharp-tongued in that conversation, and she was still here, still employed, and Min Jae-kwan's voice was still sitting in her chest doing something she couldn't name. She went back to polishing. Mrs. O found her in the kitchen an hour later. "You survived," the old woman said, which was not a compliment but was the closest she came to one. "I may have said something rude." "You held your ground." Mrs. O poured herself tea with the precision of someone performing a ritual. "That's different." Halima looked at her. "Mrs. O, how long have they been like that?" "Like what?" "The way they are with people." She caught herself before she said "with me," because that phrasing suggested something she wasn't ready to examine. Mrs. O was quiet for a moment. She held her cup in both hands and looked at the window. "Their mother," she said finally, "raised 3 boys in this house alone after their father died. She raised them to take care of each other, and they do. That is all they have ever needed." A pause. "Until recently." Halima waited. Mrs. O looked at her over the rim of her cup. "They have been waiting," she said with the careful flatness of a woman who has decided to say exactly this much and not one syllable more, for someone who isn't afraid of them. She set her cup down, nodded once, and left. Halima stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, her burgundy uniform tugged straight at the hem, thinking about 3 pairs of identical winter stone eyes, and the way the corridor had felt like a conversation she hadn't known she was having. Following week moved strangely. The triplets had not acknowledged the corridor conversation again. They passed her in hallways, sat at the breakfast table while she served, moved through the house in their usual formation, and they were, objectively, professional. Correct, not unkind. But something had changed in the texture of their attention. Sungjun watched her now. Not obviously, not in a way she could name in a complaint or bring to Mrs. O, but she felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. He would look up from his paperwork when she entered a room and hold the look half a second longer than necessary before returning to the page. It was nothing. It was also not nothing. Jinwoo had started asking her questions, small ones, functional ones, where she had placed a particular document, whether she had seen Min-jae's phone charger, but each question came with that reading a document twice quality of attention that made her feel translated rather than spoken to, like he was learning her grammar. And Min-jae. Min-jae was the most dangerous of the 3. Well, she was increasingly certain because he made it look easy. He would pass by the kitchen while she was working and say something brief and dry, a comment on the weather, an observation about Mrs. O's increasingly complex filing system, and then keep walking, leaving laughter in the air behind him like something accidentally dropped. She was not laughing. She was completely not laughing. She was maybe laughing a little. The threat arrived on a Tuesday, the way trouble usually arrived, quietly, and then all at once. Halima was in the East Garden collecting the afternoon linens when she heard voices near the estate wall. She wasn't meant to hear them. She moved toward the sound by instinct, which her mother had always said was her best quality and her worst one simultaneously. 2 men, outside the wall. One voice she didn't recognize. The other she did. It belonged to one of the junior staff who had left the household 3 weeks ago, the one who had been dismissed without much explanation. She caught fragments. A name, not the Triplets, but close, a rival family name she had heard only once, in a hushed conversation between two senior staff that had stopped the moment she'd entered the room. An address, this address. A question about schedules, about her schedule. She set down the linens and walked inside and went directly to Mrs. O. Mrs. O listened without expression. When Halima finished, the old woman was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "You will go to your room and stay there until I tell you otherwise." "Mrs. O, I think I should—" "Your room," Mrs. O repeated in the voice that was not asking. Halima went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in her burgundy uniform and thought about what she'd heard and felt, the particular cold clarity of someone who has just understood that the danger is real and closer than she thought. 20 minutes later, she heard footsteps. 3 sets, the rhythm she now recognized the way you recognize music you've heard enough times, pass her door without stopping. Then silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, a conversation that was too low to hear and too intense to ignore. That evening, Sung-jun came to find her himself. Not through Mrs. O, not through a message. He knocked on her door, 2 knocks even, which she would later learn was not something he did for anyone. She opened it. He was still in his day clothes, jacket off, 1 button undone at the collar, and he looked like a man who had spent the last 2 hours doing something that required controlled fury and had not entirely finished with it. "What you heard," he said, "is being handled." "Okay," she said. "You're not in danger." "Okay." He looked at her. The corridor light was behind him, and she couldn't quite read his expression, but she could see that he was looking at her face the way you look at something you've decided to take care of. "You came to Mrs. O immediately," he said. "It seemed like the right thing." "It was." A pause. "Most people would have pretended not to hear it." "I'm not most people." Something shifted in his face. Not the beginning of a smile. Sung-jun's expressions were more controlled than that, but its prerequisite. The loosening of something that was usually held very tightly. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." He left. She closed the door and stood in the middle of her room and breathed. A few days later, the crisis broke open. It was not the external threat she'd overheard. That had been handled as promised, with an efficiency she had not witnessed but whose results she could read in the stillness that followed. It was something else. A name from their past, a former associate who had chosen the wrong side of a very old dispute, who had decided that the fastest way to damage the Kwan organization was through the people inside it. Halima was taken from the market street 2 blocks from the estate on a Wednesday afternoon. She was efficient and difficult, and bought them 4 minutes by being both, which was enough. It was enough because when the call came, all 3 of them moved. She was in a car, a blindfold on her wrists zip-tied, running calculations about exits and terrain and what she remembered about the street layout. This was the cold, mechanical part of her brain, the part that her mother had given her, when the car stopped. Not because it had arrived somewhere, because it had been stopped. She heard the impact before she understood it. Then voices, rapid Korean, and then the door opened and the blindfold was removed, and the first face she saw was Jin Woo's. He cut the zip tie himself. He didn't say anything. He looked at her hands, then her face, with the focused assessment of someone determining damage, and then he said, very quietly, "Don't move yet." She didn't move yet. Sung-jun appeared at the door. Behind him, in the distance, Min-jae was talking to 2 men in a tone she had never heard from him, the smile entirely absent, something colder and more absolute in its place. She filed that away. Sung-jun looked at her for a moment that was long and still and contained something she couldn't name. It was not relief, exactly, because relief is what you feel when you weren't certain of the outcome, and his expression suggested he had never accepted any other outcome. And then he said, "Let's go home." She let Jin Woo help her out of the car. Her legs were steady. She was very proud of her legs. The confrontation happened that night, in the bedroom, and it was not what anyone would have predicted. She had gone to put fresh towels in the shared upper floor space, a task Mrs. O had assigned regardless of the evening's events, because Mrs. O believed that disrupted schedules created disrupted minds. When she found all three of them there, they were not asleep. They were not doing anything, specifically. Sungjun was at the window. Jinwoo was reading or holding a book. Minjae was sitting on the edge of a chair looking at the floor. They all looked up when she came in. She should have left the towels and gone. She knew that. "Are you all right?" she asked instead. Nobody answered immediately, which was itself an answer. "You went after me," she said. "Obviously," Minjae said. "You didn't have to." "Halima." Sungjun turned from the window, and his voice had the quality of someone who has decided to stop managing what he says. "Stop!" She looked at him. "We would always go after you," he said. "That is not something that requires thanks or explanation. It is simply true." The room was very quiet. She looked at the three of them. These three identical, impossible, enormous-hearted, terrifying men, and felt something shift inside her chest with a weight and permanence that was completely unasked for and entirely real. "I'm going to need you all," she said carefully, "to stop doing this to me." "Doing what?" Jinwoo asked, and he sounded genuinely curious. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then, because she was built for honesty rather than comfort, "Being this." A beat. And then all three of them looked at her with those winter stone eyes, and Minjae smiled, the real one, the direct one, the one she felt in her chest, and she heard herself make a sound that was small and involuntary and entirely overwhelmed. Not a scream of fear, a sound of pure, helpless, completely undignified feeling, the kind that escapes a person when they have been holding themselves together at great personal cost, and something finally breaches the wall. She pressed her hand over her mouth immediately. All three of them were very still. Sungjun crossed the room. He didn't stop at a professional distance. He stopped close enough that she had to look up at him, and he looked down at her with an expression that was entirely undefended for the first time since she'd known him. "You are," he said quietly, "the most infuriating, sharpest-tongued, bravest woman who has ever walked through this house." A pause. "And I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the first morning you stood in that corridor and gave me that look." Behind him, Minjae said, "We all have." And Jinwoo, setting his book down, said simply, "Yes." She looked at all three of them. She had no words. She, Halima Adebayo, who had words for everything, had none. Lee Sungjun reached up and tucked a loose braid behind her ear with a touch so careful it made her breath stop completely. "Don't pull away," he said. "Not tonight." She didn't pull away. "You wanted to find out if we were gay, right?" Jinwoo said with a smirk, but Halima shook her head in disapproval. "I'm not interested in your private lit," she tried to say, but was cut off by a kiss from Minjae. "Too late," Minjae said, claiming her lips wholly, and the other brothers joined immediately, caressing her body. Halima looked down and gasped as they were all hardened. So people were lying, she thought in her head but couldn't focus as Sungjun's voice sounded in her ears. "We would make you scream our names so loud tonight that you would never think of prying in people's privacy. Please, spare me this." She tried to plead but instead found herself moaning to their touches. They devoured her like they've never had any lady for the past 20 years, each taking turns to eat her up. She gave in to their wild desires, taking each brother's full length one at a time while choking on another. Minjae went in deeply that she didn't know when she screamed out so loud. Downstairs, in the east corridor, Mrs. O paused. She had heard the sound, that brief, overwhelmed sound, and had identified its origin, and she stood very still for a moment with her clipboard against her chest and her tea cooling in her other hand. She was a woman who observed everything, who filed everything, who had, for 22 years, sent weekly reports to a woman in Busan about the state of her son's household, their health, their moods, or their habits. She had been composing tonight's report in her head for the last 3 hours. She was revising it now. From down the east corridor, voices carried, low, warm, the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. finally being said. Mrs. O turned and walked toward the stairs. Madame Kwan received the call at 9:47 in the evening. She was in her sitting room in Busan, still dressed, the way she was always still dressed at this hour because she had never fully learned how to stop working. She listened to Mrs. O's voice on the line, the careful, precise voice, the voice of a woman delivering information she had been observing for weeks and had finally concluded about. When the call ended, Madame Kwan sat very still. She thought about the other thing, the thing she had been hearing for months in pieces, or from staff who gossiped where they shouldn't, from second-hand reports that had made her stomach tighten with a worry she hadn't known how to name. The young masters don't bring anyone home. No women, no one, just each other. People are starting to say... She had dismissed it. She had told herself it was a rumor, staff gossip, the kind of thing that accumulated around powerful men who kept to themselves. But tonight, listening to Mrs. O's careful voice, hearing the shape of what she was describing. 3 sons, 1 woman, a sound she had not heard from that house in years. Madame Kwan stood up, walked to the window, looked at the lights of Busan below her, and felt something move through her chest that was equal parts relief and the particular terror of a mother who has realized the world is moving faster than she can manage. She needed to go to Seoul. She needed to meet this woman. And she needed, she thought, gripping the window frame with both hands, staring at her own reflection in the glass, to make sure that whatever was happening in that house was something she could live with. Because if what people had been saying all those months, all those careful and pointed whispers, had any truth in them at all, she needed to be sure they were all straight. Her sons, her 3 sons. This cannot be. This simply cannot be. I have to do something. Her phone was already in her hand. To be continued in part 2. Besties, if this story wrecked you in the best way, you already know what to do. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which of the 3 brothers has your whole heart. Is it Seong-joon with his controlled fire? Jin-woo and his quiet intensity? Or Min-jae and that smile that means absolutely everything? I'm reading every single comment. Share this with someone who deserves a story this good. Afro-Korean drama empire. We'll see you in part 2.